We crossed a large court, entered a great door, and stood upon a pavement of purest white marble, deeply worn by footprints. Before us, in the flooding moonlight, rose the noblest ruins we had ever looked upon. The Propylae, a small temple of Minerva, the temple of Hercules, and the grand Parthenon. We got these names from the Greek guide, who didn't seem to know more than 7 men ought to know. These edifices were all built of the whitest Pentelic marble, but have a pinkish stain upon them now. Where any part is broken, however, the fracture looks like fine loaf sugar. 6 caryatides or marble women, clad in flowing robes, support the portico of the Temple of Hercules. But the porticos and colonnades of the other structures are formed of massive Doric and Ionic pillars, whose flutings and capitals are still measurably perfect, notwithstanding the centuries that have gone over them and the sieges they have suffered. The Parthenon originally was 226 feet long, 100 wide, and 70 high, and had 2 rows of great columns, 8 in each at either end, and single rows of 17 each down the sides, and was one of the most graceful and beautiful edifices ever erected. Most of the Parthenon's imposing columns are still standing, but the roof is gone. It was a perfect building 250 years ago, when a shell dropped into the Venetian magazine stored here, and the explosion which followed wrecked and unroofed it. I remember but little about the Parthenon, and I have put in 1 or 2 facts and figures for the use of other people with short memories. Got them from the guidebook. As we wandered thoughtfully down the marble-paved length of this stately temple, the scene about us was strangely impressive. Here and there, in lavish profusion, were gleaming white statues of men and women, propped against blocks of marble, some of them armless, some without legs, others headless, but all looking mournful in the moonlight and startlingly human. They rose up and confronted the midnight intruder on every side. They stared at him with stony eyes from unlooked-for nooks and recesses. They peered at him over fragmentary heaps far down the desolate corridors. They barred his way in the midst of the broad forum and solemnly pointed with handless arms the way from the sacred fane. And through the roofless temple the moon looked down and banded the floor and darkened the scattered fragments and broken statues with the slanting shadows of the columns. What a world of ruined sculpture was about us, set up in rows, stacked up in piles, scattered broadcast over the wide area of the Acropolis, were hundreds of crippled statues of all sizes and of the most exquisite workmanship, and vast fragments of marble that once belonged to the entablatures, covered with bas-reliefs representing battles and sieges, ships of war with 3 and 4 tiers of oars, pageants and processions, everything one could think of. History says that the temples of the Acropolis were filled with the noblest works of Praxiteles and Phidias, and of many a great master in sculpture besides. And surely these elegant fragments attest it. We walked out into the grass-grown, fragment-strewn court beyond the Parthenon. It startled us every now and then to see a stony white face stare suddenly up at us out of the grass with its dead eyes. The place seemed alive with ghosts. I half expected to see the Athenian heroes of 20 centuries ago glide out of the shadows and steal into the old temple they knew so well and regarded with such boundless pride. The full moon was riding high in the cloudless heavens now. We sauntered carelessly and unthinkingly to the edge of the lofty battlements of the citadel and looked down. A vision, and such a vision, Athens by moonlight. The prophet that thought the splendors of the New Jerusalem were revealed to him surely saw this instead. It lay in the level plain right under our feet, all spread abroad like a picture, and we looked down upon it as we might have looked from a balloon. We saw no semblance of a street, but every house, every window, every clinging vine, every projection was as distinct and sharply marked as if the time were noonday. And yet there was no glare, no glitter, nothing harsh or repulsive. The noiseless city was flooded with the mellowest light that ever streamed from the moon, and seemed like some living creature wrapped in peaceful slumber. On its further side was a little temple whose delicate pillars and ornate front glowed with a rich luster that chained the eye like a spell. And near by, the palace of the king reared its creamy walls out of the midst of a great garden of shrubbery that was flecked all over with a random shower of amber lights, a spray of golden sparks that lost their brightness in the glory of the moon, and glinted softly upon the sea of dark foliage like the pallid stars of the Milky Way. Overhead, the stately columns, majestic still in their ruin, underfoot the dreaming city, in the distance a silver sea. Not on the broad earth is there another picture half so beautiful. As we turned and moved again through the temple, I wished that the illustrious men who had sat in it in the remote ages could visit it again and reveal themselves to our curious eyes. Plato, Aristotle, Demosthenes, Socrates, Phocion, Pythagoras, Euclid, Pindar, Xenophon, Herodotus, Praxiteles, and Phidias, Zeuxis the painter. What a constellation of celebrated names! But more than all, I wish that old Diogenes, groping so patiently with his lantern, searching so zealously for one solitary honest man in all the world, might meander along and stumble on our party. I ought not to say it, maybe, but still I suppose he would have put out his light. We left the Parthenon to keep its watch over old Athens, as it had kept it for 2,300 years, and went and stood outside the walls of the citadel. In the distance was the ancient but still almost perfect temple of Theseus, and close by, looking to the west, was the Bema, from whence Demosthenes thundered his Philippics and fired the wavering patriotism of his countrymen. To the right was Mars Hill, where the Areopagus sat in ancient times and where St. Paul defined his position, and below was the marketplace where he disputed daily with the gossip-loving Athenians. We climbed the stone steps St. Paul ascended, and stood in the square-cut place he stood in, and tried to recollect the Bible account of the matter. But for certain reasons I could not recall the words. I have found them since. Now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given up to idolatry. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews, and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, To the unknown God. Whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. Acts chapter 17. It occurred to us after a while that if we wanted to get home before daylight betrayed us, we had better be moving. So we hurried away. When far on our road we had a parting view of the Parthenon, with the moonlight streaming through its open colonnades and touching its capitals with silver. As it looked then, solemn, grand, and beautiful, it will always remain in our memories. As we marched along, we began to get over our fears and ceased to care much about quarantine scouts or anybody else. We grew bold and reckless, and once, in a sudden burst of courage, I even threw a stone at a dog. It was a pleasant reflection, though, that I did not hit him, because his master might just possibly have been a policeman. Inspired by this happy failure, my valor became utterly uncontrollable, and at intervals I absolutely whistled, though in a moderate key. But boldness breeds boldness, and shortly I plunged into a vineyard in the full light of the moon, and captured a gallon of superb grapes, not even minding the presence of a peasant who rode by on a mule. Denny and Birch followed my example. Now I had grapes enough for a dozen, but then Jackson was all swollen up with courage too, and he was obliged to enter a vineyard presently. The first bunch he seized brought trouble. A frowsy, bearded brigand sprang into the road with a shout and flourished a musket in the light of the moon. We sidled toward the Piraeus. Not run it, you understand, but only advancing with celerity. The brigand shouted again, but still we advanced. It was getting late, and we had no time to fool away on every ass that wanted to dribble Greek platitudes to us. We would just as soon have talked with him as not if we had not been in a hurry. Presently Denny said, "Those fellows are following us." We turned, and sure enough, there they were, 3 fantastic pirates armed with guns. We slackened our pace and let them come up, and in the meantime I got out my cargo of grapes and dropped them firmly but reluctantly into the shadows by the wayside. But I was not afraid. I only felt that it was not right to steal grapes, and all the more so when the owner was around, and not only around, but with his friends around also. The villains came up and searched the bundle Dr. Birch had in his hand, and scowled upon him when they found it had nothing in it but some holy rocks from Mars Hill, and these were not contraband. They evidently suspected him of playing some wretched fraud upon them, and seemed half inclined to scalp the party. But finally they dismissed us with a warning couched in excellent Greek, I suppose, and dropped tranquilly in our wake. When they had gone 300 yards they stopped, and we went on and rejoiced. But, behold, another armed rascal came out of the shadows and took their place and followed us 200 yards. Then he delivered us over to another miscreant, who emerged from some mysterious place, and he in turn to another. For a mile and a half our rear was guarded all the while by armed men. I never traveled in so much state before in all my life. It was a good while after that before we ventured to steal any more grapes, and when we did, we stirred up another troublesome brigand, and then we ceased all further speculation in that line. I suppose that fellow that rode by on the mule posted all the sentinels from Athens to the Piraeus about us. Every field on that long route was watched by an armed sentinel, some of whom had fallen asleep, no doubt, but were on hand nevertheless. This shows what sort of a country modern Attica is, a community of questionable characters. These men were not there to guard their possessions against strangers, but against each other. For strangers seldom visit Athens and the Piraeus, and when they do, they go in daylight and can buy all the grapes they want for a trifle. The modern inhabitants are confiscators and falsifiers of high repute, if gossip speaks truly concerning them, and I freely believe it does. Just as the earliest tinges of the dawn flushed the eastern sky and turned the pillared Parthenon to a broken harp hung in the pearly horizon, we closed our 13 miles of weary roundabout marching, and emerged upon the seashore abreast the ships with our usual escort of 1,500 parayant dogs howling at our heels. We hailed a boat that was 200 or 300 yards from shore, and discovered in a moment that it was a police boat on the lookout for any quarantine breakers that might chance to be abroad. So we dodged. We were used to that by this time, and when the scouts reached the spot we had so lately occupied, we were absent. They cruised along the shore, but in the wrong direction, and shortly our own boat issued from the gloom and took us aboard. They had heard our signal on the ship. We rowed noiselessly away, and before the police boat came in sight again, we were safe at home once more. 4 more of our passengers were anxious to visit Athens and started half an hour after we returned. But they had not been ashore 5 minutes till the police discovered and chased them so hotly that they barely escaped to their boat again, and that was all. They pursued the enterprise no further. We set sail for Constantinople today, but some of us little care for that. We have seen all there was to see in the old city that had its birth 600 years before Christ was born, and was an old town before the foundations of Troy were laid, and saw it in its most attractive aspect. Wherefore, why should we worry? 2 other passengers ran the blockade successfully last night, so we learned this morning. They slipped away so quietly that they were not missed from the ship for several hours. They had the hardihood to march into the Piraeus in the early dusk and hire a carriage. They ran some danger of adding 2 or 3 months' imprisonment to the other novelties of their Holy Land pleasure excursion. I admire cheek, quotation from the Pilgrims. But they went and came safely, and never walked a step.